The grand birthday celebration at Le Château Lumière was in full swing, the air thick with the scent of fine champagne and whispered conversations. This restaurant was no ordinary dining spot. It stood as the city's ultimate symbol of luxury and influence. Polished marble floors gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers, and the soft hum of string instruments floated delicately through the ornate hall. The guest list was a who's who of the elite: wealthy business magnates, influential socialites, and longtime associates of the Langley family, the hosts of the evening. Among the guests, only a select few truly belonged, or at least that was the unspoken rule. In the midst of the glittering crowd, Nina Taylor stood quietly by the entrance. She was a renowned university professor, known for her brilliance and grace, a woman whose presence demanded respect without any need for flamboyance. Nina's style was simple but elegant. A crisp white dress that flowed softly around her, paired with minimal jewelry and natural curls, swept back into a low bun. She wasn't here to impress with wealth or status, but because her husband, David Taylor, had invited her to the exclusive birthday party of a powerful family's daughter. David, a billionaire and the primary shareholder of Le Château Lumière, was a man who valued discretion. Unlike many in the room who flaunted their wealth like armor, he remained an enigmatic figure, rarely seen in the public eye despite his immense influence. His investment in the restaurant was substantial, and though he preferred to stay behind the scenes, tonight was different. His wife was attending in his stead, and her place was assured. Yet, as Nina approached the hostess stand, the elegance of the evening gave way to an unsettling tension. Claire, the receptionist, greeted her with a tight smile and cold eyes that barely concealed her disdain. As Nina calmly presented her invitation, Claire's fingers flicked through the leather-bound reservation book with practiced precision, yet no record of Nina's name appeared. The air grew heavier with unspoken judgment as Claire looked up, her voice clipped and distant. "I'm sorry, but we have no reservation under your name." Nina's calm did not waver. She explained that her husband had made the reservation and even specified their table near the garden window. But Claire's dismissive attitude remained unchanged, a subtle barrier erected not by rules but by bias. As the minutes stretched, Nina could see the subtle glances of other guests, the quiet acknowledgement of her outsider status in a room that prized conformity and exclusivity. From a corner of the room, Mark Reynolds, the restaurant manager, emerged with a practiced air of authority. His tailored navy suit and slicked-back hair gave him the appearance of control, but his eyes held a calculating coldness. He approached Nina and informed her that her reserved table was no longer available. It had been given to another guest, Isabella Harper, a young, white woman who had arrived late yet was welcomed with open arms. Isabella was draped in silk and confidence, her every movement commanding attention, the embodiment of the privileged class that ruled this space. Mark offered Nina a seat near the kitchen, a euphemism for an out-of-the-way corner where she would be out of sight and, presumably, out of mind. The implication was clear. Nina, despite her invitation and her husband's influence, was not considered worthy of the main dining area. Her presence was an inconvenience, a disruption to the polished image the restaurant sought to maintain. The tension in the room thickened as Nina's refusal to accept this second-class treatment became evident. Her posture remained dignified, her voice steady yet firm as she insisted on sitting at the table her husband had reserved. The murmurs around the room grew louder, eyes shifting uncomfortably between Nina, Mark, and the favored Isabella, who seemed oblivious to the unfolding drama. This was not just a dispute over a table, it was a clash of worlds. Nina represented quiet strength and undeniable achievement, while the restaurant's staff and favored guests represented a system built on exclusion and superficial judgments. At this moment, the glittering facade of Le Château Lumière began to crack, revealing the unspoken hierarchies that governed who truly belonged. In the background, David Taylor was still tied up in meetings, unaware that the very place he helped build was attempting to erase his wife's rightful place. But when he arrived, the evening's delicate balance would be shattered, and the true test of power and dignity would unfold beneath the chandeliers and polished glass of this bastion of privilege. As Nina arrived at Le Château Lumière earlier than planned, the anticipation of the evening settled over her like a calm breeze. Her white dress, understated yet elegant, draped effortlessly, reflecting the quiet confidence she carried within. She had no desire for spectacle or to draw undue attention. Her sole purpose was to attend the celebration as a rightful guest, the wife of the man who had helped build this very institution. Walking through the glistening entrance, she felt a pang of pride mingled with an unspoken wariness, aware of the unyielding social codes that often cloaked such events in invisible barriers. Approaching the hostess stand, Nina's composed demeanor contrasted sharply with the chilly reception she was about to receive. Claire, the receptionist with her tightly pulled bun and professionally distant expression, glanced up as Nina approached. The polite but mechanical greeting masked a flicker of something sharper in her eyes, an unspoken hesitation that set the tone for what was to come. Nina calmly presented her invitation, an ivory envelope embossed with gold, its weight a tangible reminder of the legitimacy she carried. Yet as Claire's fingers flipped through the leather-bound reservation ledger, her brow furrowed in what could only be described as disbelief or dismissal. "I'm sorry," Claire said, her voice crisp yet cold, "but I don't see your name here." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Nina reached for the letter again, gently pointing out the details, emphasizing that the reservation had been made and confirmed by her husband, David Taylor. She named the table reserved near the garden window, a spot she knew was set aside for them. But Claire's unwavering denial created a chasm between official acknowledgement and the lived reality of exclusion. Her refusal to acknowledge the reservation was not just a clerical error. It felt like a deliberate erasure. Nina's breath remained steady. Though the sting of being disregarded was keen, she refused to allow it to break her composure. She understood well the power of restraint, especially in a room designed to measure worth in whispered judgments and unspoken biases. Around her, the room's atmosphere seemed to shift subtly. The murmur of conversations dipping as curious eyes began to flicker toward the growing tension. Yet, before the situation could escalate further, Mark Reynolds, the restaurant manager, appeared with an air of authority tempered by cold calculation. Mark's presence was unmistakable, his tailored navy suit fitting impeccably, his gaze sharp and assessing. Without preamble, he addressed Nina directly. "Table 7 is no longer available," he said with a polite but final tone. "It has been reassigned to another guest." Nina's eyes searched his face, reading the message behind the words. "Who is this other guest?" she asked calmly. "Isabella Harper," Mark replied smoothly. "She arrived late, but due to her long-standing relationship with the hosts and her family's prominence, she was given priority." The name carried weight in the room, an unspoken symbol of privilege that superseded formal protocol. Isabella, a striking young white woman, adorned in silk and confidence, was already making her way through the restaurant, her entrance greeted with warm smiles and deferential nods. To the staff and many guests, she was a familiar figure, a representation of the social elite that this event catered to. That she had arrived late, yet been welcomed to claim Nina's reserved table, underscored the stark realities beneath the evening's polished veneer. Mark then offered Nina a seat in a section near the kitchen, his voice laced with a forced geniality that barely concealed the dismissiveness behind the suggestion. This area was known to be out of sight, overlooked by most patrons, and serviced with minimal attentiveness. A shadowed corner meant for those whose presence was tolerated but not embraced. The implication was unmistakable. Nina, despite her invitation and her husband's stake in the establishment, was being relegated to the periphery, confined to a space where her significance would be diminished. Nina's refusal was immediate and unwavering. Her posture straightened as she met Mark's gaze with quiet intensity. "I will not sit there," she declared firmly. "This table was reserved by my husband, and it is where I will be seated." Her words rippled through the room, drawing the attention of guests who had previously been immersed in their own conversations and displays of affluence. A subtle shift occurred as glances were exchanged. Some eyes reflected discomfort, others curiosity, and a few flickered with a barely concealed irritation at the disruption Nina's insistence represented. Whispers threaded their way through the crowd, an undercurrent of tension growing thicker by the moment. Among the attendees, attitudes varied. A few patrons expressed a quiet solidarity in their eyes, acknowledging the injustice of Nina's treatment without vocalizing it. However, there were those whose demeanors betrayed a latent displeasure, their expressions tightening as though Nina's presence threatened an unspoken order that had long governed this space. The intricate dance of power and exclusion played out silently across the room, with Nina at its epicenter. A single figure challenging the norms of privilege upheld by wealth and familiarity. Despite the swelling attention and the invisible pressure mounting, Nina maintained her composure. She understood that this was more than a dispute over seating. It was a confrontation with a system that sought to define belonging through superficial markers rather than merit or invitation. Her stance was not born of anger, but of an unyielding resolve to claim the dignity that was rightfully hers. Mark's expression hardened slightly, the manager now visibly weighing his options. His role demanded control over the evening's atmosphere, yet the growing murmurs among guests signaled that this was no longer a simple matter of table assignments. The quiet power struggle had escalated into a public assertion of respect and recognition, challenging the very foundation of the exclusivity that Le Château Lumière embodied. The moment hung suspended, heavy with unspoken questions about entitlement, recognition, and the price of privilege. In this charged atmosphere, every glance, every whisper, and every deliberate silence contributed to a crescendo that threatened to dismantle the polished facade of the evening. Nina, poised and resolute, stood firm at the crossroads of exclusion and assertion, ready to face the consequences of claiming her place in a world that preferred to erase her presence. The conflict, born of prejudice and power, was reaching its peak, setting the stage for the inevitable reckoning that awaited with the arrival of David Taylor. The atmosphere inside Le Château Lumière was thickening with tension when David Taylor finally arrived. The subtle hum of polite chatter had dwindled into an uneasy silence as eyes shifted towards the entrance. Nina stood her ground near the hostess stand, her posture unwavering, but it was clear the weight of the moment was growing heavier with every passing second. Then, the sleek sound of polished leather soles on marble cut sharply through the room, signaling the presence of someone whose influence could no longer be ignored. David stepped into the softly lit dining hall with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to commanding spaces without uttering a word. His tailored, charcoal suit hugged his frame perfectly, and his calm, deliberate gaze swept across the room until it landed firmly on Nina. The proud gleam in his eyes was unmistakable. This was his wife, and he was here to reclaim her rightful place. As David approached, the tension that had settled over the crowd only deepened. He ignored the wary glances and murmurs as he made his way to Nina's side, his presence a steady force against the undercurrent of exclusion that had tried to swallow her whole. Without hesitation, David turned his attention to Mark Reynolds, the manager whose calculated dismissal had ignited this confrontation. "Mark," David's voice cut through the room, low but unmistakably commanding. "Explain to me what's happening here." Mark shifted uncomfortably under the weight of David's gaze, the manager's carefully constructed composure starting to falter. He glanced at Nina, then back at David, struggling to find words that might soften the mounting storm. "Mr. Taylor, there's been a misunderstanding about the reservation. Due to unforeseen circumstances and the late arrival of a valued guest, adjustments had to be made." David's eyes narrowed, his tone sharpening. "A misunderstanding? Nina's reservation was confirmed weeks ago. The table was booked under my name. There should be no confusion." Mark opened his mouth to reply, but David raised a hand, silencing him with the authority of someone who had seen too many polite evasions mask harsher truths. "Let me be clear," David continued steadily. "This isn't about a simple scheduling error. I want to know why my wife was not only denied her seat but also offered a place near the kitchen. A section for those deemed less worthy. Tell me, Mark, is this how you treat guests based on the color of their skin or their lack of ostentation?" A heavy pause fell over the room. The words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and undeniable. Mark's face flushed as he attempted to gather his thoughts, but the truth in David's accusation was too stark to evade. David didn't give Mark the space to respond freely. "You can stop making excuses," he said firmly, "because I have proof that Nina's table was reserved and confirmed. This isn't just about disrespect, it's discrimination, and it's unacceptable." Around them, the guests grew silent, the previous buzz of luxury and entitlement replaced by a palpable discomfort. Whispers stirred like a breeze trying to find its voice, and the soft clinking of glasses seemed suddenly out of place in the charged atmosphere. The veneer of effortless elegance was cracking, revealing the underlying tensions masked by crystal and silk. Mark swallowed hard, the manager's professional mask slipping as he realized the severity of the situation. "Mr. Taylor, our intention was never to cause offense. We strive to maintain an atmosphere of excellence for all guests." David's gaze remained unyielding. An atmosphere of excellence does not require exclusion or humiliation. It does not justify pushing someone aside because they don't fit an arbitrary image of privilege. You've crossed a line that cannot be ignored. The room held its breath as David took a step closer, his voice dropping to a steady, controlled level that carried the weight of both warning and resolve. "As a majority stakeholder and investor in this establishment, I am not only prepared to demand accountability, but I will also exercise every right I have to ensure this kind of discrimination ends immediately. Should this behavior continue, know that legal action will follow. This restaurant will not be a place where bias masquerades as hospitality." A hush fell, the significance of David's words settling over the crowd like a final verdict. Mark's shoulders slumped slightly as he realized this was no longer a matter of internal dispute, but a reckoning that would reshape the very foundation of Le Château Lumière. The implications stretched beyond one table, beyond one evening, signaling a challenge to an entire culture that had quietly perpetuated exclusion beneath its polished surface. David turned toward Nina, his voice softening just enough to convey solidarity and strength. "You belong here, always have, and I will make sure no one forgets it." Nina met his gaze, the fire within her eyes mirrored in his. Together, they stood as a united front against the invisible forces that had sought to diminish her presence. Their resolve was a silent declaration, a challenge to the status quo, and a promise that change was not only necessary, but inevitable. The guests, once absorbed in the luxury surrounding them, now witnessed a confrontation that transcended social niceties. It was a moment that laid bare the uncomfortable realities hidden beneath the gleam of wealth and influence, an undeniable reminder that dignity and respect must never be optional, nor reserved for a select few. David's intervention had not only disrupted the evening's carefully curated order, but had also ignited a spark of transformation. As the room held its breath, it became clear that this was no longer just a birthday celebration. It was the beginning of a challenge to power structures, a demand for justice cloaked in quiet but unyielding authority. And as the murmurs turned into a collective recognition of the injustice faced by Nina, it became evident that the true luxury of Le Château Lumière would no longer be measured in crystal and caviar, but in equity, respect, and the courage to stand for what is right. The charged atmosphere at Le Château Lumière had barely begun to settle when David Taylor took decisive action that would change the course of the evening, and indeed, the future of the establishment itself. Without hesitation, he summoned an emergency meeting with the board of directors and senior management to convene that very night. The urgency in his voice left no room for delay. This was no longer a matter of social niceties or internal protocol. It was a reckoning. As the boardroom filled with sharply dressed executives, the weight of expectation pressed heavily on the room. The polished obsidian table gleamed beneath the soft lighting, but no amount of decor could mask the tension that thrummed between the walls. David stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding attention with quiet authority. He opened a sleek black folder and began presenting the incontrovertible evidence that would lay bare the hidden fractures beneath the restaurant's cultivated image. First, he produced the original reservation confirmation for Nina's table, meticulously time-stamped and verified by the restaurant's own booking system. Every detail was clear. The table had been reserved weeks ago, and the booking had been made under his name. Then, he displayed the edit logs, digital records showing a troubling pattern of manipulation. These logs detailed numerous instances in which reservations made for guests of color had been either removed, reassigned, or shifted to less prominent seating, often replaced by late-arriving white guests with established connections to the restaurant's elite clientele. Each entry was timestamped and linked to actions taken by Mark Reynolds and several complicit members of the reservation staff, revealing a systemic practice rather than isolated errors. The spreadsheet David projected illuminated this discriminatory behavior with cold precision. Over a dozen documented cases in just the past 6 months, where minority guests were effectively erased or marginalized. The figures were impossible to dispute, and the silence that followed was thick with discomfort. The executives exchanged uneasy glances, some visibly unsettled by the depth of the evidence. It became clear that the carefully curated facade of exclusivity was nothing more than a mask concealing entrenched biases that had quietly governed the restaurant's operations. Whispers of concern rippled through the room as David laid out his firm stance on accountability. With a measured tone that brooked no objection, David declared that Mark Reynolds had breached the company's ethical standards and violated its commitment to equitable service. The board was faced with no choice but to act swiftly and decisively. Mark's authority was immediately revoked, and he was escorted from his position as general manager. The severity of his actions, deliberate discrimination against guests based on race and appearance, left no room for leniency. The news of Mark's dismissal and the reasons behind it quickly leaked beyond the walls of Le Château Lumière. Media outlets, social commentators, and industry insiders swiftly seized upon the scandal, amplifying calls for transparency and reform within the luxury hospitality sector. The restaurant, once revered for its opulence and exclusivity, became a symbol of a broader movement demanding equity and accountability. Despite the initial storm, the following day dawned with a renewed sense of hope and transformation. Nina and David returned to Le Château Lumière, this time greeted with the respect and recognition they had been denied. The staff, many of whom had witnessed years of silent injustice, now approached with newfound warmth and acknowledgement. The once rigid social barriers began to dissolve as the establishment embraced a culture of inclusivity. Central to this transformation was the implementation of a transparent reservation system, overseen by an independent third-party organization. This new system ensured that every booking was publicly verifiable, changes were logged and auditable, and discriminatory practices were no longer possible to conceal. The digital platform served not only as a tool for fairness, but also as a beacon signaling the restaurant's commitment to change. Furthermore, a number of employees who had been marginalized or overlooked under the previous regime were now elevated to positions of influence within the restaurant's hierarchy. Their voices were actively sought in shaping new service protocols, and their lived experiences informed ongoing staff training initiatives. Empowered and heard, these individuals helped foster a workplace culture grounded in dignity and mutual respect. The story of Nina and David's stand against injustice became a catalyst for wider industry reforms. Other luxury establishments began auditing their own practices, introducing bias detection mechanisms and revising hiring and guest service policies. The ripple effect from this one restaurant's reckoning resonated far beyond its walls, inspiring a movement toward genuine equity within spaces historically defined by exclusivity. As the day progressed, the ambiance within Le Château Lumière subtly shifted. The air, once heavy with unspoken prejudices, now carried an undercurrent of possibility and renewal. Guests dined with a greater awareness, servers engaged with a deeper sense of purpose, and the very architecture seemed to breathe in the promise of change. David and Nina, seated together once more at the table that had sparked this transformation, shared a quiet glance that spoke volumes. Their journey from exclusion to empowerment was a testament to courage and the relentless pursuit of justice. The restaurant no longer stood as a monument to privilege alone, but as a space where respect and fairness reigned, redefining what true luxury could mean. In that moment, it was clear that the legacy of Le Château Lumière would no longer be written solely in crystal and silver, but in the principles of equity, transparency, and unwavering integrity. The battle had been won, but the work to maintain this new standard had just begun. and Nina and David were ready to lead the way. Building upon the monumental changes set in motion by David's decisive actions, the atmosphere at Le Château Lumière evolved into something far greater than anyone had anticipated. The next evening, Nina Taylor returned to table number 7, the very seat she had once been denied. Yet this time, there was no need for flamboyance or spectacle. She sat with a quiet calmness and unshakable confidence, a living emblem of transformation and justice. The elegant white dress she wore carried a new meaning, not just grace, but resilience. Her presence filled the room not with demands but with the undeniable power of rightful belonging. Le Château Lumière had become more than a luxury dining destination. It was now a beacon of transparency and inclusion within the elite world of high-end hospitality. Word spread rapidly, and the restaurant was lauded as a model institution that embraced diversity and fairness without compromise. Their newly implemented reservation system, overseen by an independent third party, set a new standard for accountability, ensuring that the biases which once marred their reputation could never again take root. This shift was not merely technical but cultural, a wholesale redefinition of what prestige and excellence truly meant. Nina found herself stepping into a new role beyond the restaurant's walls. Invitations poured in from conferences and panels focused on fighting discrimination and championing equality in society. Her experiences and voice resonated deeply with audiences eager to learn how courage and integrity could challenge entrenched systems of exclusion. In forums that once might have felt distant or intimidating, Nina now spoke as a respected authority, using her story to inspire change and encourage others to reclaim spaces where they had been marginalized. Meanwhile, David Taylor leveraged the momentum to extend his influence across his broader business ventures. Recognizing that meaningful reform must ripple through every facet of corporate culture, he committed to embedding principles of equity, transparency, and respect into each company under his stewardship. His leadership style shifted from the shadowy, quiet investor to an active advocate for inclusivity, demonstrating that true power is measured not by control alone, but by the ability to uplift and transform communities. Together, Nina and David embodied the profound truth that standing up for one's rights carries the power to alter not just individual lives, but the very fabric of society. Their journey underscored a universal message: courage in the face of injustice is never isolated. It sends waves outward, challenging norms, reshaping institutions, and forging pathways toward a fairer, more compassionate world. The story of Le Château Lumière had become a testament to the fact that change begins when someone refuses to be invisible, refuses to accept the status quo, and insists on being counted. As the city lights shimmered outside the windows of the restaurant that evening, the world within was a different place. One where dignity was no longer a privilege reserved for the few, but a right recognized for all. Nina's smile, serene yet powerful, reflected a future where more voices would be heard, more barriers dismantled, and more tables opened to those who had been sidelined for too long. For those watching and listening, the takeaway was clear and compelling. Never underestimate the impact of claiming your rightful place. Whether in a restaurant, a boardroom, or society at large, the courage to stand firm ignites progress not only for yourself, but for generations to come. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think about the power of standing up for fairness and respect, share your voice. Let us know your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss stories that empower and uplift. Together, we can keep building a world where everyone's seat at the table is honored.